Our first psalm is one that introduces the entire collection of psalms. It's one that I think of as describing the good life. By genre, it is classified as a wisdom psalm. That is, it teaches wisdom about life. And it is also known as a Torah psalm because of its emphasis on following the law of the Lord. I want to take a look at it first just from the standpoint of Hebrew poetry. And first, we'll take a look at parallelism. We see in the very first verse 3 verbs that in parallel: walk, stand, and sit. These are also in parallel with the phrases that follow them: the counsel of the wicked, the way of sinners, and the seat of mockers. And it's very easy to see that this is an example of what we call synonymous parallelism. 3 lines that are saying similar things using slightly different terminology. Second verse also is a case of synonymous parallelism. In this case, delight corresponds with meditate, and law, of course, corresponds with law. Now, you might think this is a chiasm because there is a crossing pattern that emerges there, but if you look at it in the Hebrew language, the word order is not that of a chiasm. So this is where it gets a bit tricky. If you think you found a chiasm, you should go check with the Hebrew word order itself. I like to use Bible Study Hub online, where you can look up Hebrew interlinear and see whether there is actually a chiasm or not. So we have 2 verses of synonymous parallelism. The next verse, verse 3, gives us an example of synthetic parallelism. Synthetic parallelism is where one line builds on the previous. So the tree is planted, it yields fruit, its leaf doesn't wither, whatever he does prospers. So there is a building, a synthesis, and additional information added with each line. The wicked are like chaff that the wind drives away. And this particular verse is labeled emblematic parallelism. This is a type of parallelism that essentially is what we would call a simile. The wicked are like chaff, he is like a tree. And we note the correspondence between verses 3 and 4. I'm getting ahead of myself a bit, but notice that the tree is planted, but the chaff is driven by the wind. It's rootless. And the tree, of course, is contrasted with chaff. Now, chaff is the shell of the grain that is left after the harvest. It's completely useless. It is tossed up in the air with the grain. The wind blows it away because it's lightweight, and the grain falls to the ground where it is harvested and used. The 5th verse: the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous, is another clear example of synonymous parallelism. Wicked corresponding to sinners, judgment corresponding to the congregation of the righteous. And then verse 6, the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. And if we draw our correspondence here, we see the way of the righteous corresponding to the way of the wicked, and the Lord knowing and the wicked perishing. Knowing and perishing, or the NIV says in place of knowing, the Lord watches over. So this is an example of antithetic parallelism, an opposite statement indicated by the word but. It's also a chiasm. You do see the X pattern there of a chiasm, and it is indeed that way in Hebrew as well. The force of a chiasm in this case perhaps could be to break up the pattern, because here we've had 5 verses that are essentially a similar pattern of synonymous parallelism, and then we have it broken at the end as if to say this is the conclusion of the matter. The second characteristic of Hebrew poetry is chiasm. We'll take a look at that in light of the entire structure of the psalm. First thing we notice is that the first 2 verses are antithetic to one another. And again, we see that evidenced by this word but, to create this contrast between the blessed man, what he doesn't do rather, and then what he does. So verse 1 is what a blessed person doesn't do. Verse 2 is what he does. Verses 3 and 4 are also antithetic to one another. A tree is contrasted with chaff. These are 2 opposite descriptions. Notice how verse 3 is very lengthy and elaborate, where verse 4 is very short and sweet, much like the chaff versus the longevity of a tree. Verses 5 and 6 are also antithetic. They are opposite to one another. Verse 5 describing what the wicked and the sinners will not do, and verse 6 describing what God will do and what will happen to the wicked, what the wicked will do, in other words. I also see some correspondence with similar language between verses 1 and 5. The counsel of the wicked, the congregation of the righteous are contrasted. The way of sinners versus the way of righteous in verse 6 contrasted. The seed of scoffers, the wicked will not stand. So these phrases show similarity in the way that they're contrasted there, antithetic to one another. So we might label verses 1 and 2, verses 5 and 6 as A parts, and that leaving the B part as the center part of the psalm, giving us what is called a two-point chiasm, where it creates a frame that draws attention to that which is in the center. I like to think of it as a picture frame. Verses 1 and 2, 5 and 6, those are the frame. Verses 3 and 4, those are the pictures. It's sort of two pictures in one, a tree and chaff laid side by side, framed by the outer verses. And finally, we'll take a look at the figurative language in this psalm. First, we notice the obvious metaphor of walk, stand, sit. We're talking here not about specific actions that a person is taking, but rather a way of life, walking as a way of life, as a habitual way of doing things. Standing might suggest a little more permanence, of firmness. And then, of course, sitting would express even a greater degree of permanence and unyielding stubbornness. So those verbs function as metaphors. We also have, in verses 3 and 4, we have a simile. A simile is a direct comparison using like or as. So a comparison using like or as, like a tree, like chaff. In verse 5 again, we have a metaphor. The wicked won't stand, nor sinners won't stand in the congregation of the righteous. This is a metaphor of their position. And the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. This is an anthropomorphism because it's describing the actions of God in human terms of knowing. That's a human characteristic. And the NIV translates this, the Lord watches over, which again could be understood as a human action. So some anthropomorphism there. Finally, some other poetic devices, observations about this particular text. This is a wisdom psalm, and so it's meant to give us instruction. And one of the characteristics of a wisdom psalm is it will have a macarism. Macarism comes from the Greek word makarios, which is translated blessed. And so a macarism is a statement of who a blessed person is. It begins with blessed is, and then it describes the blessed person. These occur 26 times in the book of Psalms. Blessed is alternately translated as happy or well off, and it means to be well off in God's economy. I like to say to have the good life as God defines it. Verse 2 gives us another important word, the law of the Lord. The word law is the Hebrew word Torah. Now, when we think of law, we typically think of rules and regulations, guidelines. But I think the word Torah needs to be thought of a little more broadly than that in terms of instruction or revelation. We tend to have some negative stereotypes with the idea of law and rules. I think it's wiser to think of it as wisdom, the wisdom of the Lord. And on his law he meditates. Now the Hebrew word for meditate there is hagah, which means to murmur or to mutter or to groan. In every case that it's used in the Old Testament, it implies sound, making sound out loud. It is used of a lion growling over their prey. So the suggestion here is that meditating implies speaking aloud, to recite the law of the Lord, to speak it, to mumble it, to murmur it, to mutter it, to get your lips moving when it comes to it. That's not how we typically think of meditation, is it? Typically we think of meditation as thinking or reflecting quietly, contemplating on something. That doesn't seem to be the Hebrew force of that word. Something else we see poetically here is a break in the patterns. The typical pattern for Hebrew poetry is to have a two-line verse. But we see in verse 1 we've got 3 lines. We have the statement, "The blessed is the man," then we have 3 statements about what he doesn't do. Then verse 2 is rather typical, 2 lines. And then verse 3, we have, 5 lines? He is like a tree, planted, yields fruit, leaf doesn't wither, all he does prospers. So this breaking of the pattern, notice how 4, 5, and 6, those verses are typical. So there's something about verses 1 and 3 that kind of jump out, and perhaps they're there for focus. You might also notice that there are the 3 descriptors of the blessed man, what he doesn't do. In verse 1, doesn't walk, stand, or sit. And then in contrast to the tree, which is planted, which yields fruit, which doesn't wither. So there seems to be perhaps some correspondence there as well. Also, look how the first 3 verses fit together in a group thematically, and it begins with the word blessed and it ends with the word prosper, 2 very similar ideas. So I would call these framing verses, or perhaps framing words, and there seems to be a progression here. A blessed person, what he doesn't do, what he does do, and then verse 3, what he is like. In contrast to that, verses 4, 5, and 6 describe a digression or regression, perhaps, as the wicked are described as rootless, driven by the wind, not standing in the judgment, or not standing in the community of the righteous, not watched over by the Lord, but rather perishing. So there is this sort of digression to destruction. We go from blessing to destruction overall as we look at this psalm. And there's a clever use of the Hebrew alphabet in this instance. The very first word of this psalm is blessed. In the Hebrew, the word is ashrei, which begins with the letter aleph, the first letter in the Hebrew alphabet. The last word of this psalm is tobed, perish, and it begins with the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet, tav. So in English, the force of this would be the first word of this psalm would begin with A, and the last word would begin with Z. Now, if that were the case, what conclusion might we draw about this psalm that the poet was trying to communicate? I think we'd suggest that he was trying to say, this is all there is to say about that. From A to Z, this is it. It is complete. And indeed, that's often the way that the Hebrew poet will use the alphabet to indicate completeness and totality or finality. So from A to Z, from Aleph to Tav, this is the truth of the matter. One final observation is in verse 6. You'll notice that the word Lord is capitalized. This is a convention in English translations to indicate the presence of the Hebrew word that underlies it. And the Hebrew word we do not know how to pronounce. It is a 4-letter word, YHWH. That's how we would transliterate the letters. It is the name of God that was given to Moses. It is sometimes thought to mean I am. That's how it was introduced to us in Exodus chapter 3. I am has spoken, I am that I am. And that name for God ceased to be pronounced at some time in Jewish history. And whenever a Jewish person was reading the scriptures, instead of pronouncing that name of God, they didn't do so out of reverence and respect for the divine name. They substituted the word Adonai, which means Lord. And they took the vowels for that word Adonai and inserted them into the consonants, YHWH. If you do that, you get something close to Yahweh. And so that would be the way we would pronounce it most likely, although we can't be certain of that. But out of respect, in the Jewish reading of the scriptures, the name of God is not pronounced. I do use the YHWH abbreviation to refer to that. I think it's significant to note that there's a difference in meaning when you're using this personal covenant name of God, Yahweh. So keep that in mind as we read the Psalms. We'll make more of that distinction later on, but make note of that when you see that from now on, whether it is Lord all caps, which means Yahweh, or I am, versus Lord lowercase, which will be translated as Lord or Master.